Is this turned on?
Clink, 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 clink.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I know that we're competing with a really important opening at Momo tonight, so it's really, really a pleasure to see so many people here. It's a kind of a very special evening for us. It's because we've been working on this book for quite a long time. Boris first did a version of it for a garage museum in Moscow approximately 4 years ago. Since that time, we've been working on translation and organizing a publication of it in English here jointly with MIT Press. It's also our first collaboration with MIT, which is also quite interesting. So yes, it's really great pleasure to have the book in print and to do this tonight. So my name is Anton Vidokle, I run e-flux, and I will make a short introduction, and then we will have maybe a very casual discussion of the book and Cosmism and all of the related topics. So the book is called Russian Cosmism. Cosmism emerged in Russia before the October Revolution and developed throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Like Marxism and the European avant-garde, the two other movements that shared the intellectual moment. Russian Cosmism rejected the contemplative and the transformative, aiming to create not merely new art or philosophy, but a new world. Cosmism went the furthest in its vision of transformation, calling for the end of death, the resuscitation of the dead, and free movement in cosmic space. This volume, edited by Boris Groys, collects crucial texts, many available in English for the first time, by the radical biopolitical utopianists of Russian Cosmism. Cosmism was developed by the Russian philosopher Nikolai Fyodorov in the late 19th century. He believed that humans had an ethical obligation not only to care for the sick, but also to cure death using science and technology. Outer space was the territory of both immortal life and infinite resources. After the revolution, a new generation pursued Fyodorov's vision. Cosmist ideas inspired visual artists, poets, filmmakers, theater directors, novelists, such as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, who read Fyodorov's writings, architects and composers, and influenced Soviet politics and technology. In the 1930s, Stalin squashed Cosmism, jailing or executing many members of the movement. Today, when the philosophical imagination has again become entangled with scientific and technological imagination, the works of the Russian cosmists are newly alive and relevant. So I want to introduce Boris and Claire Bishop, but I just want to make maybe a couple of comments about the book itself. It's one of the first times that there is a compilation of the historical original text of Russian cosmists and biocosmists that comes out in English, which brings up the problem of translation. It's incredibly difficult to translate writings from Russian to English because the languages are so different and in many ways quite incompatible. English, like many Western European languages, is deeply rooted in Latin, which is basically like the foundation of everything. But in the concepts that exist in Latin and also in the history of the Roman Empire and things like that, Russian language, like most Slavic languages, is rooted in very, very, very different tradition, has concepts that are untranslatable to English, and partakes in very, very different history that borrows from Far East and Persia and just completely different traditions. So it was really quite a feat to translate this text, because also, right around the time of revolution, a lot of writers, a lot of authors and artists were trying to invent a new language, a new visual language, but also a new language in writing, in literature, and to literally invent new words to represent new thinking and new concepts, which are not only, kind of unusual for Russian language, but to translate them into English is even more difficult. So I want to thank very much the translators who worked on this volume, and there was a number of them, including Thomas Campbell, Ian Diblat, Anastasia Osipova, Carolyn Rees, and Anastasia Skobedo, because it's really a labor of love to translate writing, and particularly to translate this kind of writing. There is also another thing that, despite as good as this translation is, there is still another moment that because a lot of writing in Russia of that period, late 19th century, early 20th century, comes out of a really profound literary tradition. So even though a lot of the authors in this book are not novelists or not fiction writers, but are scientists, artists, and so forth, their writing in original language is just incredibly powerful and literary, which is also something quite difficult to translate to English. So in reading this book, it's just really good to keep in mind that despite all of our efforts, the original is much, much, much richer and more beautiful and more poetic, and somehow touches you even more deeply. So, having said this, I would like to introduce Claire Bishop, who is a professor in the PhD program in art history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Her books include Installation Art, A Critical History, which was published in 2005, Artificial Health, Participatory Art and the Politics of Spectatorship, published in 2012, and Radical Museology, or What's Contemporary Art in the Museums of Contemporary Art, 2013. And of course, Boris Groys, the editor of this volume, who is a philosopher, an art critic, a media theorist, and a curator. He's a global distinguished professor of Russian and Slavic studies at the New York University, senior research fellow at the Karlsruhe University of Art and Design, and professor of philosophy at the European Graduate School in Switzerland. So, I think this is probably enough of an introduction for now, and maybe I will turn this over to Claire.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Anton, for inviting me over. I am the person on the panel with the least, underlined, the least knowledge of Cosmism by a long shot, and so I'm going to play the role of, well, it's not even playing a role. I am the naive questioner / moderator. And what I know about Cosmism is gleaned basically from skimming this book this afternoon, plus Wikipedia, plus Molly Nesbitt's current piece in Art Forum, and actually quite a good critique of Cosmism that's in the current issue of the Romanian art journal Idea. So I'm just going to... give you what I understand as the nutshell. Sorry, I should also emphasize that I'm a real skeptic here as well. I really don't quite understand the fascination with Cosmism and reviving this movement that seems a little esoteric, masculinist, techno-utopian, and metaphysical. There are many reasons why it makes me just... why should I be interested in this? But I'm hoping by the end of the evening, maybe I will have a better perspective on this. So I've always understood, from my lightning fast research on this, I understand Cosmism to be a set of transhumanist writings proposing to overcome mortality by using technology and science to resurrect the dead. And from what I understand, and certainly from the range of essays in this book, it's not a unified movement. It's a ragbag of different writers and positions that brings together, and this is another reason I think to be maybe skeptical, it brings together Western Enlightenment thinking, especially this great faith in science, with Russian Orthodox Christianity and Eastern mysticism. So it's a bit of everything and nothing, maybe. So Anton has already talked about the centrality of Nikolai Fedorov to this, to the idea of Cosmism. He's writing in the late 19th century and dies in 1903. The next wave of writing seems to be in the 20s and 30s. It then gets sort of revived again there's an interest in this in the 70s and 80s, and then after the transition in the early 1990s, there seems to be yet another wave of interest in it, and now we're experiencing the fourth or fifth wave of interest in Cosmism. So Fedorov is represented in this book with only one short essay on astronomy and architecture. So I guess the first question is, if Fedorov is so central, why is there only a 4-page essay on him by him here? But to give you a sense of the kind of the range of stuff that's in this book, so Fedorov's essay proposes this great electric boat that can, through which self-reconstituting man might travel to other planets. Other authors in the collection discuss the relationship between solar energy and mass movements like revolution. That's Shijevsky, who begins the book. The possibilities of transplants and transfusions as a cure for old age, which would be Bogdanov. And another example would be envisaging the future of life on Earth and other planets by how do I pronounce this? Tsiolkovsky. And I think I appreciate that Anton's saying that in the original Russian they're moving and literary, because they struck me as ranging in tone from the like wacky visionary to the punishingly dull. Some of them are really hard work to get through. And so what seems to tie them together is less actually this interest in resurrection, which is only infrequently mentioned in the text, and more of an interest in transhumanism and prolonging and improving human coexistence. So, okay, so how bad is that summary of Russian Cosmism? What do you see as the linking thread between the essays collected together in this book? That's a question for you, Boris. And why only one Fedorov essay if he's really a foundational figure here?
First of all, I'm glad and I'm grateful to be here and present this book, and I'm very grateful to Anton Vidokle and support by him, by e-flux, and the engagement of the e-flux and his personal engagement with this topic. Now, if you ask what is common, then I would say, I would start with politics, not with immortality, not with religion, not with many other things, but with a political stance in a political landscape of a certain period of time. Namely, all of these people, in one way or another, belong to the socialist or anarchist movements. Fedorov was actually a socialist, second generation biocosmists, so 20s were all more or less anarchists and part of the anarchist movement, and so on and so on. And at that period of time, so end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, and the period after the revolution, they formulated for themselves a very simple question. The question is, how is it possible to produce a substantial social and political change, to really transform a society without application of a crude violence? How it is possible to persuade people to go into the different political and social system without applying the apparatus of oppression and suppression? Yeah? Because there was a deep suspicion in the socialist and anarchist leftist circles in Russia that the revolution, coming revolution, will be very violent, and that the state will be obliged to apply even more radical violence, yeah, to create a basis for a new society. So the question was how to make this transition as peaceful as possible. And the answer was the only possibility is to offer a program that would create a kind of, let's say, harmony between the individual goals of every individual, yeah, in society, and society as a whole. And this individual goal was understood, obviously, as survival. Yeah, you know, the concept of survival is the oldest concept here in the political thought here, everywhere, in the East and the West. But survival leading to immortality, yeah, because immortality is highest possibility of survival. Yeah, we are living not toward the death, we are living toward immortality in one form and another. Yeah. Different forms in different social systems and different religions. Now already Fyodorov said that it is implausible that people would work for the socialist and communist future if it will be only next generations or future generations who would have a chance to live in this future. Why should I suffer today for future generation to be happy? Yeah, that he said is quite a difference if we compare communism with Christianity, because Christianity promised eternal life for martyrs and saints suffering here and now. Yeah, and the suffering for the communist future seemed to be senseless. Yeah, because suffering for the progress, we have no reward. And he understood progress as a mechanism of destruction every generation for the sake of the next generation. That is true for the socialist progress. That is true for the capitalist progress. That is true for any concept of progress. Yeah, every generation is sacrificed to progress. Next generation is sacrificed to next generation, and so we have a kind of bad infinity of exploitation, where this future never comes. Anarchist, he was more coming from the socialist movement and from the concept of the progress. Anarchist thinkers more came from the perspective of a radical liberation of the individual. And then the question was, if every individual is totally liberated, how the commonality can be organized, yeah? How interaction can be created when we switch off the violence by the state, control, police, and all these things. And the answer was again that if every individual would be sure that the society works for his or her immortality, then this individual would be ready to accept it. So this was a kind of socialist/anarchist utopia that tried to remove revolutionary violence and Marxist concept of the state and state violence as an intermediate period, or the intermediate stage for preparing the communist future, and to organize something like a consensus. I believe that this consensus is already rooted in a religious tradition, so in a kind of common interest in immortality and resurrection. That was this initial common starting point. But then, of course, the individuals' itineraries, cultural, intellectual itineraries of the people were dictated by their profession and by their own background.
And then my question about Fedorov and why his scanty representation in this book?
Well, all the representation are scanty in a certain way. I would actually, and I initially did it, I would include his essay about the museum, because his essays about the museum is a crucial one, yeah, for the whole theory. Because he saw the museum, he saw art and museum, the art museum, as a starting point for resurrection memory and creating of the new civilization. But this text was already published in a different collection of texts, so it made no sense to repeat it. And that's why I took this, because, you know, maybe this analogy is not very obvious, yeah? But it was obvious in my mind, yeah, maybe because I'm a reader of Foucault. Yeah? And Foucault speaks, when he speaks about heterogeneity and heterospaces and heterotopias, he speaks about two examples of them. One example is a museum, and the other example is a ship. And so the idea to turn the whole Earth into a museum of the previous generations and to turn the whole museum into a ship moving into the cosmic space has something in common. And I think that Foucault saw this let's say, proximity of this concept. And so that was, I was seduced to use it.
Okay. I mean, the other example Foucault has is the cemetery, of course, which would then be a beautiful linking device with the museum and how Fedorov writes about it.
Yes, of course. But you know, if you have cemetery, if you have a museum, and if you have a ship, yeah, these all three are figures of death, yeah, of course. But the symmetry, maybe only in American movies, yeah, about zombies, yeah. But in general, or at least traditions were not experienced as a place of the afterlife. And obviously ship, also this ship of the eternal, you know, Holland, yeah, flying Holland or whatever, flying Dutch, yeah, I think it's in English, and the museum are figures of traditional figures of afterlife, yeah. So that was interesting for me.
Yeah. Can I ask about the relationship between Cosmism and communism? Because obviously, the kind of Fedorov's writings precede communism, but then you're asserting a link between, you have Klutzis on the cover. This is asserting a link with the 1920s and the post-revolutionary context. A lot of the writings that are included here were published during the 20s and 30s. And at the same time, some of these writers were then also perceived as opponents of communist ideology and sent to labor camps and executed. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Cosmism has a revival of interest among dissident religious circles in the 70s, and then comes up again immediately after the transition in 1990. So it seems to have a vexed relationship to communism. Can you pass for us where it overlaps and where it parts ways?
Well, I already referred to that. Actually, the history of socialist movements and communist movements in Russia doesn't start with the revolution, obviously. The socialist parties and socialist movements dominated public opinion in Russia throughout the last, let's say, 2 or 3 decades of the 19th century. Conservative movement was actually very weak, and liberal was also very weak. So intelligentsia, cultural classes, they were more or less socialist oriented. And Marxism also had a huge influence. What the reaction of not only by Fedorov, one can find other people at the same time reacting in the same way, reacted precisely against the concept of progress, so against a relationship between communist ideal and basically bourgeois capitalist concept of progress. This connection was seen as a kind of original sin of the communist ideal. And in many ways, critique of the progress that Fedorov practiced reminds me strongly, in some cases, even literally, of the later critique of the concept of progress by Walter Benjamin. So Walter Benjamin absolutely repeats the same figures here, that also, without knowing probably Fedorov, but he repeats the same figures, and he uses the same figure in a very strange way of messianism, weak messianism, and quotation of the past, and literal quotation of the past. That all are figures that Fedorov also uses. Yeah, that's the basis of the museum, the basis of all of that. And so, communism, yes, but violence, progress as privileged instance and privileged side of this violence, no. Yeah, that was this kind of difficult relationship. That was a dream. Yeah, that was a project. And speaking about this text again, maybe I cannot develop it now. Yeah, but it's interesting that Auguste Comte was very influential in Russia, in the socialist movements, said that the astronomy is a limit of communism. Discussing communism, he says that society cannot become communist because it cannot transform itself in a radical way. And the reason for that was astronomy and powers of gravitation, cosmic powers that defined life of people, also on Earth. And already in the 90s, you find some texts here arguing against gravitation. One is very interesting text is by Lunacharsky, who then became a minister of culture, yeah, in the Bolshevik government. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, he speaks, we should be Nietzschean. We should not believe in a unified power of gravitation. We should break gravitation and create communism. And the same idea you find in Malevich, Victory Over the Sun. So this idea of breaking cosmic order, breaking power of gravitation to create a new society, and that is what Fedorov actually speaks about in this short text, I found it very central, yeah, for the whole polemics.
But
can I say something? Yeah, but also in terms of relationship to, let's say, the governmental communism of USSR of 1930s, I think it was not like, it was not a black and white relationship. In a way, Cosmism is very sympathetic to communism, but it's much more of a heretical kind of a movement. Yeah, it's always been heretical since the beginning in its relationship to Orthodox Church, because at the same time as Fedorov constantly writes about Orthodox Church and Easter rituals and all of that, and God is in every paragraph, at the same time he kind of proposes to supplant God and just use kind of our own technology and science to achieve immortality, and the goddess kind of becomes not a very central figure in his sort of whole picture of things. So, which is one of the reasons why he actually didn't publish during his lifetime, I think, because he probably publishing his essays at that time would imply immediate excommunication from Orthodox Church. In relationship to communism, a lot of cosmist authors have a very similar kind of position. Yeah, while they're not against communism in any way, yeah, the kind of alternative that they propose, or the difference in interpretation of, social goals and things like that, immediately resulted in a kind of excommunication, which at that moment implied execution. Yeah. So yeah, just wanted to clarify this.
No, that's helpful. I mean, it seems to me, Boris, that you're attempting to retrieve a materialist take on cosmism. I mean, Anton just mentioned there's God in every paragraph, and it seems that other literature around cosmism seems to emphasize the spiritual and the transcendent and the metaphysical much more than you do. And I wondered if you would agree with this, reading that your selection of texts is geared towards a revisionist presentation of cosmism as more materialist and scientific and with much less emphasis on the spiritual.
Not at all. Really not. You know, religious thinking, neo-religious, neo-Byzantine, neo-Orthodox thinking, in the Russian culture at the end of 9th century, beginning of 20th century, was very strong. One had at that time very interesting philosophers and very influential philosophers. Solovyov was extremely influential philosopher. He speaks about transformation of cosmic life. He speaks about transformation of society in spiritual terms. He was friendly with Fyodorov, but against him. His whole school, including Bloch, Bielay, so the whole symbolist movement, was against him. So if you follow the tradition of religious philosophy, it was split. And religious philosophy, who actually tried to be really orthodox and neo-Byzantine, was unanimously against Cosmism. And also the whole literature, Russian literature, that was done in this tradition was anti-cosmist. If you look at who was pro-cosmist, Russian avant-garde, that wanted to be materialist, authors like Platonov who wanted to be a radically materialist, and so on and so on. So the question, how the transformation of society, cosmic life can occur through the spiritual rebirth and spiritual redefinition of humanity, or through the material technological practice, this split the Russian intelligence at that time. And of course, I take one side. I take cosmic side because spiritualists were anti-cosmic side. Together, actually, with a very powerful, especially in Russia, theosophic and anthroposophic movement. They were also against cosmists, And Blavatsky, and all of them, so they were also influential in England and USA. It's all completely different line of Russian thought of that time. I think there's this kind of mixture of different attitudes has to do with lack of precise knowledge of the intellectual landscape at that time.
Okay. So I appreciate that you're trying to do a kind of materialist political reading of cosmism, but when I start reading the first essay in this book, it's very hard to square this with an account of human agency. And so I'll give you an example. So the first essay is by Zizhevsky, and he's researching the connection between solar energy and mass movements like revolution, right? So at moments of increased solar energy, there is more social turbulence. And he even goes so far as to kind of research particular governments come into power at moments of even more solar energy. Now, when you look at this, it seems to completely diminish human agency and political action in favor of something that's basically like astrology or the horoscope.
That is totally true. And that's why that I was started with it. So, if you have a certain theory, cosmic theory, that defines human as a body, like any other animal body. What is interesting in Zizhevsky, he says there is no difference between viruses, bacteria, small animals, big animals, and human bodies. Under the influence of sun, they behave all in the same manner. Okay? Now, that is a starting point for a reversal. every technology begins and starts, and technology begins and starts with Fedorov, after the human beings are reduced to bodies. As far as something remains that is spiritual, such a program of reformation and technological restructuring of the world is impossible. You know that Bataille actually used this model of Chizhevsky. Yeah? He used that in his own La Part Maudite. And he says, why I'm materialist? He says, because I want to despise the world. I don't despise God, and so I don't believe in it. And if I'm a materialist, I can despise the world. And if I despise the world, I can change it. Yeah, I cannot change what I believe in. Yeah. So that is why I started with Chizhevsky. Now, speaking about Chizhevsky, you know, for a very long time, I think last couple of decades, we have a lowest number of sun activity in the whole history of modernity. Yeah, that was this very famous end of history and postmodernity. Now, global warming has nothing to do with that. That is turbulence on the sun, and that can be seen as these patches. Yeah, yeah. So suddenly, we have 2-3 years ago a rise of the sun activity, and he says that rise of the sun activity means activization of left-wing parties or right-wing parties. Okay, now it's right-wing parties, but the correlation is absolutely one-to-one precisely how Chizhevsky saw it and predicted. Yeah, yeah, year for year. Yeah, you can compare his data with actual political data; they're identical.
Okay, so let's move on to the relationship between cosmism and art, right? So in the introduction to the book, and which it was partly what Anton read at the beginning, you say that Cosmism influenced the vast majority of the Soviet avant-garde. But then, Boris, in your introduction, you describe it as a counter-project to the Soviet avant-garde. So are you both right, or what is the relationship between Cosmism and the avant-garde? It's a counter-project, or is it both the counter-project and a source of inspiration? In what way is it a counter-project?
Well, counter project was, of course, Prolet Cult was a counter project. Prolet Cult doesn't have so direct relationship to Cosmism, even if indirect Cosmism relationship is obvious. Yeah. But
you should explain. I mean, the founder of the Prolet Cult is Alexander Bogdanov.
Is Alexander Bogdanov. Alexander Bogdanov actually was co-founder of the Bolshevist Party, together with Lenin. And then he became more and more, let's say, positivist, empiricist, less and less orthodox Marxist. And so at a certain point in time, Lenin broke with him and wrote a book about that, Materialism, Empirical Criticism, that very much reads today as Meyasu texts, I would say, yeah. With more or less the same examples. Yeah. So it was also anti-Kantian, anti-positivist, and so on and so on. And now he moved to writing activities, and he moved to Project Cool, I say what it is. And then he started these experiments with blood transfusion. With
By which he died.
Yeah, of revagination, yeah, which he died. Now, Project Cult was a Facebook, I would say, before the internet. Yeah.
No.
Yes, not no, but it was yes. What is a contemporary internet, a Facebook, and so on? It is a platform that gives you a possibility to create images and write without any expectations that what you produced will be seen or read.
In that respect, yes, you're
So,
right.
yeah. So it's production against without contemplation and consumption. Already Wagner said that there is a possibility to think art as pure production without contemplation and consumption. That would be Gesamtkunstwerk, yeah, total work of art, where everybody participates and does something, but nobody looks at it. And that was a principle. That is a principle of the internet, yeah, because only God can see internet, but God doesn't exist, as Nietzsche told us. And that was a principle of prolet cult. So Bogdanov organized platforms for people, ordinary people, workers, peasants, ordinary people. They could write poems, they could write prosa, they could...
Perform plays.
No.
Theatre was really central to
No. Literary production, artistic production, paintings, all of that. That was collected, but never seen. So they sent this material. Material was registered and then put in the spaces, specific spaces. When the spaces were full, they were closed and never opened again. The only thing that remained was a register, yeah? Who wrote that? Yeah, that's the metadata, yeah? We would say in a language of the internet. So only metadata remains. Okay, in a very few years, 20 million of people entered Prolet Cult program. That really means that already at that time, people didn't want that somebody listened to them. They were not interested in somebody see the artistic production. They were only interested in the act of painting, writing, drawing, making music itself. Yeah. That was, Wagner predicted, that was we have now, and that was developed by Bogdanov, and then the whole project was closed. Yeah, it was closed by Lenin after the number of members of Prolet Cult exceeded the members of Communist Party. Yeah? He decided that is not a good idea. At that moment, it was closed. Yeah? So you have this first attempt, which is, of course, a very vitalistic one. It's what Wagner says, it was Nietzsche said, that we are actually not interested in the spectators. We are not interested in other people. Yeah? Or as the certain commentator that said, the others are the hell, yeah? Okay. We are interested in a realization of our vital energies as bodies. We want to produce, we want to expand into the world. Yeah? That was a Wagnerian Nietzschean concept of art production. That was completely reversal of the normal bourgeois relationship where spectator dominates the artist. Yeah?
I mean, I've always had a slightly different understanding of Bogdanov. The things that I have read advocate a collectivized production of art and theatre on the model of the factory or the collective farm. It's really like the industrialization of creativity. And it's a really hardline stance that denounces individualism in favor of collective goals.
Not at all. Not at all.
The stuff I've read says that.
Prolet Cult was based, as I said, on an uncensored, and what is very important, and why.
That's not incompatible with what I'm saying. I mean, there's no criteria of judgment in relationship to it. Let you finish.
Let me a second. That this was uncensored activity. You know, uncensored, not in the political terms, that is very important, but not in aesthetic terms. There was nobody who would say, it's a bad poem, yeah?
That's
And
what I mean.
that-
There's no criteria of
that-
judgment in relationship.
That was
to
real liberation. Yeah, that was real liberation. Because real liberation is abolishment of aesthetic censorship and not political censorship.
Let's bring this back to Cosmism. We have strayed far away from this now.
And look,
This is Cosmism.
and
I've fallen into
avant-garde
it.
was against it.
Sorry?
Avant-garde was
Was
against
against
it.
it. Yes, of
They
course.
wanted aesthetic censorship. They wanted to be better. What these collective things, the people write in the West a lot now, and America a lot about that, but it's more different parts of groups collection related to this project quit movement. It was very much like, how to say, aestheticization of the everyday life and aestheticization of the everyday processes. For example, people looked their movies, like their real visual material. So people looked at the petit pas ballets, the classical ballet. Then they looked at the workers working on the industrial factory, and they tried to find a system of movement that relates the classical ballet with a system of movements. Yeah? So they tried to find a common ground between aesthetic and industrial system of movements. But that is completely different thing here. The basis of prolet cult was this abolishment of aesthetic censorship. It was a decision to forbid to say it's not good written, it's not well painted. Yeah, that was the point.
Okay, and so I'm tempted to say, and how does this relate to Bogdanov's later writings, which feature in here? Because these are absolutely not, these have nothing to do with prolet.
No, that nothing to do, but have a lot to do with his concept of change. Yeah, he developed a very complicated, I didn't want to include it in this totality, a very complicated system of thinking why things are changing, the technology. It's a very complicated and very sophisticated theory, a very interesting one. But he also used that for this concept of rejuvenation. So he believed in a kind of quasi-vampiric theory that if you take the blood of young people and inject into the old people, you rejuvenate them. And so he made experiments by taking blood from the students and injecting them to the professors, and professors felt much revitalized, Everybody laughed, you laugh, everybody laughed for them. But now, they repeated these experiments, not with students, but with me's, And really, they take young and old me's, and the old me's begin to feel much better. So it works. It works in a university. It works with the me's too.
Can we? Talking of a sort of an absence of aesthetic criteria, you've put Klutzis on the cover. What is there a cosmist aesthetics? Maybe this is one for Anton. In the films that you've made, can we speak of a cosmist aesthetic sensibility or an agenda?
Yeah, absolutely, and it has absolutely nothing to do with my films. But there is, of course, aesthetics and the notion of art and the paradigm of art is absolutely central to Cosmism, and this starts with Fedorov, because unlike most philosophers that I've ever come across, who are usually quite dismissive of art, for them art is merely kind of design of your clothing, or Hegel
philosophers
thinks
tend
it's
to
already
discover
over.
art as the last thing they do. The last thing they write tends to be on art.
Yeah, but I think that it's a deeper problem, because artists, at the end of the day, still work with matter, right? Where philosophy kind of consists of itself as being in the realm of ideas. it sees itself as superior over matter. So artists are still, you know, kind of playing with dirt, yeah, so to speak, yeah. So it's always kind of like this, secondary sort of thing. Fedorov writes about art in a totally different way. For him, it's something as important as science, as important as social organization, as important as religion. It's as powerful as technology. In fact, he does see art as a technology of immortality, and he gives this disproportionate, like really kind of enormous importance and power to artists and art, except that his concept of art is a little bit more ambitious, let's say, than I would say the common understanding of art right now. For him, art is basically the project of immortality, yeah? And in a way, it's nothing esoteric, yeah? Because I think when you went to a museum, an art museum in the 19th century, what you probably saw is a lot of portraits, a lot of landscapes, a lot of representations, sculptures, you know, which depicts likenesses, that preserve likenesses. So he felt that, okay, this is a movement in the right direction. The only thing is, rather than preserving likenesses, you should actually try to preserve life itself, yeah? So in a way, he sees that art as having all the right sort of ideas in place. It just needs to be radicalized to reproduce life, to preserve life, to be this kind of methodology, technology of immortality. But then, so this is the first goal, and it seems like he actually had a secondary goal, right? Because what happens when that is perfected and everybody is immortal and people are resurrected? What do we all do? Because there are very many of us and we never die. We can exist in space. And here he has the second notion of art, which is actually quite beautiful, very much, it sounds like maybe some kind of American thinking in 1970s. He feels that basically that the goal of art, or the role of art, is to be the way by which we could transmit our capacity for feelings and thinking and seeing and perception to inanimate matter of the universe, yeah? And so all of this immortal humans, right, what they do with their eternity is they're all artists, yeah, but their artwork is this kind of universe scale sort of educational project to teach inanimate matter how to feel and think, and in order to kind of perhaps, let's say, spiritualize the universe, in order to produce a god, yeah, because that goes back to Nietzsche and God being dead in 19th century, right? So all of this very, very complex and long-term project of Fedorov's Cosmism, right, is basically the end point of it is to make the entire matter of the universe conscious, and in that moment it will become the same as God. It will not replace God, but it will be exactly the same for all intensive purposes, yeah? So that's basically the horizon of art for Fedorov, yeah.
Wow. So, so who do you imagine as the audience for this book? And what do you imagine artists as a potential audience for this? I mean, I guess I'm asking whether Cosmism is, you know, one more forgotten utopia from the modern period that is currently being revived, you know, along with a resurrected, or, to use this Cosmist terminology. But it seems to be as a kind of very quirky thought experiment rather than a proposal that can be taken forward or that can be activated in the present, right? It's more how we'll laugh at the kind of the crazy ambitions for immortality and transfusing blood and life forces and the solar system as a determinant of revolutions and so on. So in a way, it is I do have a serious question. Like, who do you imagine taking an interest in Russian Cosmism today?
I think that I'm much more Bogdanovian in this sense. I think one does things and then looks what comes out of it. Even if nobody would be interested, I would be totally satisfied, yeah? I am in this sense like a member of the prolet cult. But having said that, I would say that maybe a certain one of the motive, yeah, for dealing with that was a negative reaction against the concept of globalization and global circulation. Yeah. So because the rhetoric of globalization is a rhetoric of the closure, yeah, the concept of circularity on which globalization, circularity on all the levels, yes, exchange of commodities, exchange of art, exchange of this, even exchange of ideas, yeah. All these concepts are somehow deeply depressing, yeah, for me, yeah, and they're very much dominated. That is why I began to be interested in these ideas, because, you know, on the level of mass culture, we have a lot of movies dealing with disruptive moments here. Also, Lars von Trier used this concept of danger coming from a constant space and destroying everything. Now, one read enough German classical literature to know that where the danger grows also the hope, yeah. So this disruptive potential of the cosmic space outside of circularity is not guaranteed. There is no ontological guarantee for that. So as far as you are religious, you have a kind of ontological guarantee for this circulation. As far as a non-believer, and I'm non-believer, you don't have ontological guarantee. And if you don't have ontological guarantees, then you have the possibility of disruption, but you have also the possibility of projection of your own utopian ideas on this space. And I would say that is what Russian avant-garde did. They were less occupied, I mean, I agree with Anton that most interesting aspect is this art technology. But if you look at the 10th, 20th, beginning of the 30th of the Russian avant-garde, there was a kind of projection of utopian concepts into the dark, dangerous space of cosmos. That begins with Black Square of Malevich. That begins with repetition that is understood as image of cosmos, image of cosmic darkness. And then different projects. You know, this image is taken for a series of drawings by Klutzes. One of this is New York, skyscrapers growing in all the directions. So in a cosmic space, in a kind of cosmic New York beyond gravitation, yeah, where the skyscrapers can grow in every direction. So this kind of phantasmatic space, personal phantasmatic space, is identified with cosmic space. Something Freud and Nietzsche also spoke about, this possibility. So I was always seduced by this kind of disruptive, maybe under the influence of Bataille also, early influence of Bataille, disruptive and at the same time phantasmatic quality of cosmos, yeah, beyond any divine or also technological guarantee of this global circulation.
I have a much more prosaic sort of thing to say about the potential, who should be the readers for this book. First of all, art historians, yeah, because so much of North American art history is based on the Soviet avant-garde, and it's, you know, I mean, from my perspective, it emits so much really important historical context and what actually influenced the artist, what the artists were thinking about, largely because, you know, it was suppressed in the Soviet Union, it was not translated. So this is not an accusation, this is not a challenge that I sort of throw to the English-speaking art history establishment, but I think it's about time that you know, all of these primary sources make their way back into the context of this production, which is really central, because, you know, there is a reason why October journal is called October and not November and not September, yeah? Right, so there is something very fundamental about the Soviet avant-garde that's at the very foundation of our contemporary understanding of what is important in art practice today, yeah? But it seems that it's slightly maybe misunderstood because key pieces of information have been missing for many, many, many decades. So I think that is kind of a very important audience for the book, or an audience that could really benefit by reading it. I think also artists, yeah, because there is something in this paradigm of thinking that opens up possibilities for art practice to this universal scale, which is really affirmative and empowering, particularly at this point in history of art and history of politics, and in many ways, yeah. But I think it's basically useful for all mortal human beings, yeah. And maybe for artificial intelligence and inanimate objects, yeah. So I think it has really a potentially, yes, universal appeal, yeah.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to end with one last reservation. So, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So I think there seems to be a bit of conflict between the universalism of the term cosmism, you know, that there is the kind of the radical utopianism of equality for everyone through life after death. It's equality through immortality. And then the nationalism of the descriptor Russian, right, which stands against the Soviet avant-garde or Moscow conceptualism, for example, to take two other. So we could see this. So I just wonder where, you know, what do we do with the Russianness of Russian cosmism? Is there any non-Russian cosmism?
Well, when we speak about ancient Greek thinking, yeah, we speak about Plato and Aristotle, and they are truly universal, yeah. At the same time, they are Greek, yeah. The same can be said about many French authors and Germans and English, yeah, and so on, so on.
No, I'm just wondering
So-
whether this is part of...
universal.
There is this sort of, you know, there, at the moment we see in the art world a lot of picking up of idiosyncratic minor histories from different countries, which then become rehabilitated and become a way of doing some kind of national rebranding.
I wouldn't say that it is a case. And my examples are not random, yeah, because if we see, so if we remember Plato and Aristotle, if we remember French Enlightenment, if we remember, let's say, German idealism and Hegel and so on, why we do that? Because they imply the break with the national tradition in themselves. So they were Greek, but they braked with Greek mythology. They broke with religious tradition in their own countries. Yeah. Now, this period in Russian history, at the end of 9th century, beginning of 20th century, was a period of self-universalization of Russian culture. That was a very violent, intellectually, artistically, and politically, like French Revolution and so on. A very violent process. You should remember that in Russia, the civil war was understood officially as a war between international, so Red Army, and Russia, that was White Army, yeah, and Red Army won. So the international won over Russia. That was understood this way. And Blokia wrote at that time, let us shoot into Russia, yeah, let us kill Saint Russia. Yeah. So that was an attempt to break with the past in different ways. Yeah? Political, communist, artistic, and so on and so on. So it was a moment of universalization of a culture. And I think that these moments are important. Yeah, when Anton says that October is important, why October is important? October is a point like French Revolution was important. So, as such, an attempt of the national culture break itself and become universal. To what degree this culture could do it is always an open question. This question was, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, answered by Stalin and by his theory of building socialism in one country. At the moment you proclaim this goal, you break with international perspective, you go back, even maybe on a different level and so on, so you go back to the national state. And it's interesting that that was a moment. So the moment of proclamation of socialism in one country was a moment where Russian avant-garde was persecuted. These cosmic movements were persecuted. All the people who develop international, cosmic, universal perspective. So that was the beginning of the closure of the country. So we speak here about short period of time of this eruption of universalist energies. Yeah. And that has nothing to do with any kind of sentimental, stylization of Russianness. Yeah. That has nothing to do with that. That is opposite of such a stylization. That is a bloody attempt to break with it.
Good, that clarified that. Questions? There is a hand at the back and one at the front. We have to send the mic.
I guess my question is, isn't it just Silicon Valley? Blood transfusions, biological augmentation, space flight. This is just literally Silicon Valley. And it seems to me that at any moment of political or social or cultural rupture, there are more or less two camps, right? There's like in the 60s, the politicos versus the hippies, the people who want to change the material and social conditions, and the people who kind of want to dream their way around it or come up with some kind of technological hack. So it just seems to me, it doesn't invalidate the project or make it uninteresting. Maybe it even provides new lineages of it. But in talking about its relevance today, I assume you have to pass through that association, right?
Well, yes and no, as always in these cases. So yes, because Silicon Valley, what you speak about, it's also about personal immortality and things like that. However, at least my impression is that Silicon Valley has as a basis of its activity in this respect also a kind of secured, privileged position. I think the difference is this one. These concepts of Russian cosmism were socialist and social projects. What they wanted a new society that as a whole had this goal of immortality for everybody. It was a socialist and sociological questioning, sociological in a sense that people in a different way answered the question, how such a society that has immortality as its goal should be organized, how it should be governed, how it should be institutionalized, and so on and so on. That is this disruptive and transformative element. If some people in I don't believe it, but if some people in Silicon Valley gets immortality, what would change that in the structure of society we are living in? Nothing. They would have more lifetime, and they already have more money. Yeah? The whole system of stratification of our society, the whole system of class relationships, the whole economy remains the same. So we should not compare these two phenomena. This comparison would be superficial because it would ignore the transformative and social power of the cosmos ideas. Yes, because of course, yes, because of course, it is an effect. Silicon Valley is partially, but only partially, an effect of materialist thinking. I say partially because the idea of singularity, so ideas that you can map your consciousness on a computer, is a rebirth of the worst early Christian concepts of the soul. And even before, it's like belief in a possibility of the soul to be implemented in, I don't know, wolf of, or I don't know, cows. So it's a kind of concept of wandering of the soul, this time from man to computer, from computer to a human being. That is still totally idealistic, spiritualistic, and actually unscientific. Of course, there are also scientific aspects in this research, and these scientific aspects are materialist and probably will lead to certain results. But there's also a lot of, undigested concepts of immaterial information and all the stuff of the 80s. So all this new mystical, techno-mystical stuff, that kind of that I cannot accept as a true student of Russian cosmism.
My question would be about the production under cosmism and how they imagine production and what is the source of the status quo in the society where kind of immortality happened already. Is it like printers that print food for free or whatever? Like, because there should be some kind of exchange, right? We cannot get rid of exchange for sure. And also, if we produce some kind of products, do they still have aura? Do they have some kind, like, do they have to be fetishized and circulate, or they can be just stored as in prolet cult and people be kind of supplied by something outside of the realm of economy? Yeah, thank you.
So, speaking about reproduction of humankind, they were all against sexuality and natural way of reproduction, all the cosmists, but also all the Russian avant-gardists, including Malevich and so on. They believed that there should be invented better ways to produce men. So we have to start with resurrection of the previous generations instead of producing of new ones. And then after we learned it, we can go further. But if we go further, then cosmic dimension begins to be important, because then this new generation, also old generation, should be transported to other planets. So what the people wanted is colonization of the cosmic space and expansion of the mankind on different planets and stars.
There are quite different visions of it in my knowledge. Yeah, I think Fyodorov is a very he was a kind of a very what do you call it? Not stoic, but ascetic person. Yeah, he lived an incredibly simple life. Basically, was giving away most of his very small salary because he was a librarian to charity. Apparently, he only existed on tea and bread most of his life. So, and he never owned anything. He lived in rented rooms. So this is really somebody that's almost like a kind of a monk or something like that, that does not really consume anything. He was quite adamantly opposed to certain kind of commercial production, capitalist production. He has many essays totally criticizing, for example, the World Fair in Paris for basically glorifying products of industrial production, which are completely superficial. But his critique is basically that we waste all of our resources, yeah, all of the productive powers of the planet and all of the natural resources in pursuit of this kind of superficial things, where we really need to reorganize the productive forces of the planet in order to resurrect the dead and achieve immortality. Yeah? So if I imagine a society organized around his principles, it's very ascetic. There are no luxuries, there is no expensive restaurants, there is nothing like that. Clearly there is no capitalism, and he's quite explicit that, you know, capitalist economy is just not efficient enough to produce resources that are necessary for such an enormous project as immortality and resurrection of the dead. But on the other hand, if you look at, for example, Bogdanov and his ideas of how such a society would look, there is a kind of a really nice indication of that in a science fiction novel he wrote, which is called The Red Star, which is basically about socialist society on Mars. And which is incredibly descriptive. He describes every sort of social form, from factories of the future to museums of the future to private houses of these advanced Martians, which are not completely immortal yet, but they have incredibly long lifespan. They kind of taught themselves how to extend their lifespan. So for all practical reasons, they're almost immortal at that point, yeah? And he describes in great detail everything from transportation systems to, you know, so there is a kind of a model of a kind of this idealized social organization of a kind of a proto-cosmist society in that book. And of course there are many other visions, because as Claire pointed out from the start, and I think I very much agree, there is not a singular vision of cosmism, yeah? It's not like existentialism or, you know, a lot of other kind of philosophies that manage to negotiate at the end a certain kind of a unified, you know, approach or unified stance on something. Yeah, it's more of a polyphony of different voices that are sometimes almost contradictory, yeah, that share some affinities and share some imaginaries, but are not identical to each other.
How were they envisioning the resurrection of the people to take place, given like decomposition, body turns into a skeleton in about 10 years?
You know, Fyodorov, no really, Fyodorov was asked this question, and he said, I don't understand you. It's already everything in my writings. I think that his idea was that society simply has to change itself. And instead of producing new generation, has to decide to resurrect old generation. And at the moment the society turns its sexual energies into the energies of resurrection, everything will happen in the right way. So at the moment, the decision will be taken, the ways and means will be found. So for him, what is so central was this kind of a reorientation from the looking to the future to the resurrection of the past.
Maybe in a more practical way, for Bogdanov, clearly it had to do, the technology of resurrection would be through these blood transfusions, yeah? Okay, maybe immortalization, but then probably eventually extending to a certain kind of resurrection. But the really interesting writing on this is, there was another author, Valerian Muravyov, and as far as I understand his theories, he basically, it's almost like boiling water, yeah? Because he kind of observed that there are certain things, when you replicate conditions, the same phenomena occur. So whenever you reach a certain temperature, water boils in a pot, yeah? So it seems to me that what he felt is that if there was a possibility to replicate certain kind of conditions, a historical object would have to reappear in the same way that the water always boils. Of course, this is a tremendously complicated process, but I think the key to it maybe is actually in Bogdanov's writing in tectology, in a very, very comprehensive understanding of systems, and there are different states of order and disorder. Yeah, so that would be another kind of more sort of direct idea of how they imagined that resurrection could take place.
That is one way, but when we go back to Fedorov, obviously he proposed to create a world museum where every human being would have a space. In this space, would everything be collected and documented that has to do with this human being? So photographs, images, texts, but also biological material, memoirs of the friends, and so on and so on. So it was a kind of archive of total documentation. And then, of course, somebody who would decide to use it, in a certain way, it reminds me of Kurt Schwitter's concept of Merzbau, yeah? So collection of everything that at a certain moment could be used to resurrect, but resurrect means in this way also, in this case, also reimagining. So what, the classical question, would we resurrect Hitler as he was, yeah? Probably not. We would try to reimagine Hitler as a nice person, yeah? Maybe looking at his childhood and this and that. He loved his dog, yeah. So the idea is to resurrect according to imagination. In this sense, this is really artistic act, yeah. So you collect all this material and documentation, and then you create or recreate on the basis of productive, creative imagination, yeah, basically.
Which I just wanted to point out that it's actually quite similar to the way Muravyov saw it, because if you talk about kind of recreating certain conditions that then could reproduce this, where this object would have to appear, right? You could also achieve it from accumulation of various cultural artifacts, bringing all of these things together, right? Where the object would have to remanifest itself somehow. So in a way, more sort of culturally speaking or more scientifically speaking, the sensibility was not so different somehow. Yeah.
Excuse me. I have a question. So, what is the relationship between the past generation and the future generation? Because once we have every generation bringing something else, and once they resurrect, the older generation is coming to the past, right? This is one question. And another question is who is in charge? So, how the power. Who is in charge of how exactly the human being gonna look like, the resurrected? Who has the power to decide? So this is the question.
Well, well, I think that the art system and scientific system, maybe philosophy, was the ideal case for the people. We do not appoint important philosophers or artists or scientists they show themselves through their activities. Yeah, if you read Bogdanov, you see that this dynamics is self-manifestation of the talent and genius and power of imagination that secure for individual a certain place in society. As I said at the beginning, the goal was to base everything on consensus. Yeah. What the decisive moment is to go for the future back to the past. But Fyodorov says that there are two desires that let us go into future. It is war, so we want to win war, or we want to change the results of the past wars, and fashion. Yeah, basically. When you say every generation brings something with it, brings new fashion, yeah. So if we are not interested in war and fashion anymore, and that's what he tries to persuade people not to be interested in war and fashion, then you can go back. And if you go back to creative work, then it will show, it will emerge, yeah, the leading individuals who contribute more than the others.
Can I ask a quick question, and maybe the last before we wrap up? Where does this concern for the prolongation of life and immortality come from? What is it a reaction to? Is it a reaction to an acceleration of life under industrial modernity, or an anxiety about the end of cyclical or ritual understandings of time in favor of linear progress of modernity? Or is that simply not relevant for Russia at this point, given that it was not in the throes of industrialization in the late 19th century?
It was, of course, already in the 90s, yeah, as it was written 80s, 90s of the 19th century. Russian capitalism developed very fast, yeah, what is Lenin wrote about that. But I don't think it's the industrialization, I think it's secularization. And I think that it's not about continuation of my own life in a very strange way. You know, Sartre once also said that death is not a problem, it's not my problem, because only the others die, yeah? And I never die because at the moment I die, I don't exist anymore. So it's not an event in my own life, yeah? It has no meaning for me. But what's interesting is that he presupposes a certain kind of tacit acceptance that the others die. It's very interesting that this acceptance is new. Yeah? It's culturally very recent, because all the cultures, all the traditional cultures, never accepted that the others die. They thought maybe the souls go somewhere, or maybe they change the body, and maybe they go this, and maybe they go that. This acceptance, I look at the people, I say, they all die, and it's great. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, why not? This kind of attitude toward the other, and the attitude that the others have toward me, we die, but nothing will change. Yeah, everything will go the same way, yeah, and so on. So. That was actual reason for moral indignation. Yeah, this moral indignation, you feel it's very strongly, especially in Fyodorov. Why we are ready in modernity after the period of secularization without any contradiction, without any deep psychological trauma. We are ready to accept the death of everybody. Yeah, actually, of the whole mankind. It's a much more serious problem than the acceptance of one's own death.
Maybe let's take them together and fold them into one, and you can choose which and how you want to answer it.
I have kind of had this question for, you can't see me, kind of had this question for a while. It seems like Russian Cosmism is often presented as almost an escapist solution, I guess. Mostly, I guess, if you take it as just like a thought project, but I do consider how dead serious most of these thinkers are. So I guess my question is, in relation to conservation and sustainability, since that's now such, I guess, an important endeavor in the contemporary, one of the contradictions that I see cropping up in Cosmism really often is this push and pull between leaving Earth, leaving death, but also using the resources of nature and Earth for perpetuation. So I guess I would like to hear more about how you reckon these contradictions, if they appear in the book at all, or what Cosmism can provide as food for thought about the planet we currently live on.
So my question would be, like, right now we use a lot of, we chase progress, we try to move as fast as possible, and for example, these ideas could be something that we'll chase and try to go after. And as we run very quickly, we create also a lot of problems. Like in 60s, a lot of architects designed cities and they had these visions like, oh, it's gonna be awesome, we're gonna be great, everything is gonna be connected by highways, we're gonna live amazingly. The other invention of social media but right now caused a lot of social disconnect. So how do we take these all ideas and actually put them in a, or use them the way so we don't hurt ourselves?
Well, I think that we should see that this thinking is not fictional. It is also not pragmatic, it is utopian. Utopian is something that is fictional, but at the same time can become real. Yeah? So utopia is situated between fiction and reality, and between escapism and realism. Yeah, so I would agree that it's a form of escapism, what that Trotsky also said about Cosmism, because he understood it as pure literary fiction. But it's not quite a fiction, it's utopia. Yeah? Now, if we ask ourselves what is utopia, utopia is the moment where the progress stops. Yeah? It is change from change to no change. Yeah, that starts already with Plato. Ideal state is a state that is eternal state. It doesn't change. So as far as we accept change as the only reality, we accept progress as only reality, then it means, I agree with you, that every next generation destroys the life world of the previous generation. And that actually what futurism and surrealism, many other movements in 20th century describe it. And what Walter Benjamin describes in his very famous story about Angel of History, that looking back at history sees only ruins. Now, that is what this vision, yeah, precisely this vision, what creates a desire to stop the progress, yeah, to stop the progress. To what degree the desire to stop the progress can be realized or not, for me it is an open question. Why I agree that we live today in a very dynamic, not very dynamic, yeah, but relatively dynamic technological progress. But you should remember that it was a certain period of time, and that was a time of huge geographic discoveries. So people discovered America and then Australia. So it was a huge dynamics. And then this dynamic stopped because it was nothing more to discover. I wouldn't exclude the possibility that we come to the limit of economic growth. We come to the limit of, with limit of technology, economic growth, we can come to the limit of technological development. We can come to the utopia in a form of stagnation, so in a form of anti-utopia. And I would say in that time, the utopian thinking probably gets its edge, because we are only thinking about what to do with dynamic developments, but we don't think enough about what to do with the stable aspects of our society. And that is precisely what they try to do. The stability they try to reach on a basis of general consensus. Would it be this consensus or the different one? It's an open question. But it's not fiction. It's utopian reflection about a real possibility where this kind of thinking will become relevant.
Maybe just a couple of words about the ecological concerns. You know, there is not a large sort of part of Cosmist writing that's devoted to ecology per se in the contemporary sense, but Fedorov does write about this quite a bit. I mean, he totally rejects the kind of exploitation of this planet, exploitation of natural resources as is practiced under capitalism, yeah? So there is a kind of a desire for a different relationship of nature. On the one hand, he kind of basically demands a total control of nature, yeah? But I think what he means is that nature is also inside of us, and in terms of human life, nature also implies death, yeah? So what he probably means by control of nature is the project of immortality, yeah? Because in a way we die not just because we don't have enough to eat or to drink or air to breathe, but we're kind of programmed internally, genetically, to expire at a certain point. So for him, that is a kind of an enemy, let's say universal enemy of humankind that needs to be confronted, yeah? But at the same time, there is a kind of a great concern with the other aspect of nature, which is the planet, which is the biosphere, and you know, and so forth. Also, ecological concern kind of comes up in writings of Vernadsky, who was a radio geologist who kind of came up with this notion of noosphere and stuff like that. And of course, his entrance to Cosmism is very much through thinking about planetary spheres and, you know, all of that. So it is, there is actually quite a bit of interest in that in Cosmism, not as a kind of there is not a specific essay that I can point to. It's more like interspersed in different passages and different writings. So should we end at this? Yeah, it's almost 9 o'clock. It's been 2 hours. I think we should end. So thank you so much for coming, and yeah, you could buy the book. Yeah, it's available back there. And thanks so much, Amal, for organizing this, and Kay for actually being the editor of this book and seeing it to go to print, the productive editor. And yes, see you again, I hope. Good night.